Jeopardy!
Welcome to our Jeopardy Farewell Tour. This year, our goal is to give as many teachers the chance to appear on Jeopardy before the end of the year. Today, we have with us Mr. DeWeese, a 9th grade American history teacher, Mr. Sentner, a law and justice, civil law, and contemporary history teacher, and Mr. Lisack, who is also a contemporary history teacher, law and justice teacher, and the PA history teacher. Thank you, Olav, thank you, Maddy, and of course, thank you to Mr. Bellissimo. Without further ado, let's get into our first game of the year with the Social Studies Department. Today's categories are 80s music, history hodgepodge, Olympic host cities, all the president's men. Each response is the president the person served under. And on the big money. Mr. DeWeese, since you're the oldest, we will begin with you.
Boy, thanks a lot. Let's go Olympic host cities for 200.
Host of the 2008 Summer Games, this city is set to host the 2022 Winter Games, becoming the first city to host both. Mr. Lisack.
What is Beijing?
That is correct. All right, Mr. Lisack, you have the board.
80s music 200.
One of two performers with whom Paul McCartney has had #1 singles in the 1980s. Mr. DeWeese.
Who is Michael Jackson?
That is correct. You could have said either Michael Jackson or Stevie Wonder. Mr. DeWeese.
Let's stick with 80s music for 400.
Hurry up and name this Canadian power rock trio with the 1981 album Moving Pictures. Mr. Sentner.
All right. Who is Rush?
That is correct. Mr. Sentner.
Same category, 600.
This Eagle had solo success in the 80s with hits like The Heat Is On. Mr. Lisack.
Who is Glenn Frey?
That is correct. Mr. Lisack.
80s music 800, please.
Exposure on Family Ties in 1985 repopularized At This Moment by Billy Vera and this group. Mr. Lisack.
The Beaters. Who are the Beaters?
That is correct.
How much
Seriously?
coffee did you drink this morning?
How did you know that one? That's yeah. Okay.
Where would you like to go?
80s music for 1,000.
Finish off the category. The first album. Who's Mr. Sentner?
I see them. How much time do I have? Violent Femmes. Who are the Violent Femmes?
That is correct.
Man, I was just drawing a blank.
Mr. Sentner, you have control of the board again.
Let's do All the President's Men, 200.
Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Mr. DeWeese.
Who is Nixon?
That is correct.
We weren't alive for him. It's not fair.
I love it.
Okay, Mr. DeWeese.
Let's stick with All the President's Men for 400.
Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. Mr. Sentner.
Who was John Adams?
That is incorrect. Mr. DeWeese.
Who is Jefferson?
That is
Thank-
incorrect.
I was going to say he's both.
The correct answer is George Washington. Mr. DeWeese, where would you like to go?
Let's stick with All the President's Men for 600.
Vice President Calvin Coolidge. Mr. DeWeese.
Who is Harding?
That is correct. Where would you like to go? Stick with it.
All the President's Men for 800.
Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Andrew Cuomo. Mr. Sentner.
Who was George W. Bush?
That is incorrect. Mr. DeWeese.
Who is Clinton?
That is correct.
Finish the category for 1,000.
Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. Any guesses? The correct answer is Franklin Pierce. Mr. DeWeese, you still have control of the board.
On the big money for 1,000.
We take a couple of $1,000 bills from this 1920. Mr. DeWeese.
Who is Wilson?
That is incorrect. From this 1928 president, even if they were in non-consecutive order. The correct answer is who is Grover Cleveland? Still you, Mr. DeWeese.
On the big money, 200.
His old legal foe, Mr. Marbury, might have fought this president being put on the $5,000 bill in 1918, but would have lost. Mr. Lisack.
Who is Madison?
That is correct. Mr. Lisack, you have control of the board.
I'll take Olympic host cities for 400.
In 1980, the U.S. and 64 other countries boycotted the Olympics held in this city. Mr. Lisack.
Where is Moscow?
That is correct. All right, I'd like to take a second and let you guys talk a little bit about yourselves. So, Mr. Deweese, you've mentioned that you play ice hockey, and a couple of years ago, you wrote down that you had a very interesting experience with a former student. Would you like to tell the story?
Oh, yeah. Back in 7th grade, I had one of my former students, a little mischievous in class, ended up with a detention. Completely forgot about it, but apparently he didn't. So about 10 years after the fact, we were playing against each other on the ice, and he completely laid me out. And his response was, "That's what you get for giving me detention in 7th grade."
Was it specific? Did he do it specifically because of that?
Oh, most definitely. But kudos to him. Don't get mad, get even.
Mr. Sentner, you actually mentioned Mr. Lisack in your response, and I guess you two have known each other for quite a while.
Yeah, actually, Mr. Lisack and I know each other we just decided, about 38 years at this point. I'm the same age as his younger brother, so he's older than me, but I went to kindergarten with him, and I met Mr. Lisack then.
Wow. So 38 years.
It's been a while.
And Mr. Lisack, you wrote down on yours that you're interested in comic books. Are you a collector, or do you just like to read them?
I collected for about 25 years. I amassed a collection of about 60,000 comic books, but I started selling them about 7-8 years ago, so I don't collect any longer. So if anybody's looking for anything,
Were there any
hit me up.
particular comic books that you like? Any favorite comics?
I mean, some of my best comics, like I had an X-Men #1. I sold that. I had a Walking Dead #1, and some other things like that. Some of the older books like that. But in terms of actual favorite comic book of all time, it's probably a series called The Sandman.
Very cool. All right, let's get back into the game. Mr. Lisack, you have the board.
Olympic host cities for 6.
This city hosted the Summer Games in 1964, a first for Asia. Mr. DeWeese.
What is Tokyo?
That is correct. Where would you like to go now?
Let's stick with Olympic host for 800.
It took until 1956, but finally a Southern Hemisphere city hosted this one. Mr. DeWeese.
What is Sydney?
That is incorrect.
Oh, yes, but I'm not.
The correct answer is, where is Melbourne? Close. Mr. DeWeese, it's still you.
Let's wrap that category for 1,000.
A two-time Olympic host, this New York village. Mr. Lisack.
What is Lake Placid?
That is correct.
Lucky.
I know they hosted twice. History hodgepodge for 2.
After a Senate investigation into the scandal, the Mammoth Oil Company. Mr. DeWeese.
What is Teapot Dome?
That is correct.
History hodgepodge 400.
Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus were the 3 men who made up the first this.
They're all older than me, by the way.
By
By a little bit?
I said the Senate.
All right. Any guesses?
Senate?
No. The correct answer is, what is the triumvirate? Mr. DeWeese, you still have the board.
History hodgepodge 400.
That's the one we just did.
Let's make it 6.
Lenin contributed to this then underground newspaper founded in 1912. Nothing? The correct answer is, what is Pravda? Mr. DeWeese, you still have the board.
Let's go on the big money for 400.
One number short of his presidential chronology, this president landed his face on the $2 bill. Mr.
Who's
Lisack.
Jefferson?
That is correct. Mr. Lisack.
Big money, 6.
In 1918, for his 34 years as Chief Justice, he was put on the $500 bill.
I can guess, but I can't remember.
Anybody want to guess?
John Marshall?
That's correct, but you didn't buzz in.
No, I know. I didn't want to risk the points.
Mr. Lisack.
Big money, 8.
In 1928, 27 years after his assassination, Mr. Sentner.
It was McKinley.
That is correct. Have a little more points on the board. Where'd you like to go?
What are my choices? 800.
The ancient world had 2 important cities named Thebes, one in Greece and one in this land. Mr. Lisack.
What is Persia?
That is incorrect. Mr. DeWeese.
What is Crete?
That is incorrect. Mr. Sentner, would you like to
No,
take a
I don't
stab
know.
at it? The correct answer is, where's Egypt? The last one, history hodgepodge, for 1,000. Around 1310, Pope Clement V moved the papacy from Italy to this French city, and it stayed there for almost 70 years.
What is Avignon?
That is correct. We will move on to Final Jeopardy. Mr. DeWeese, you can bet up to 1,000.
Good luck with this.
Yeah.
I wish I had my
Yeah,
calculator.
I know who's gonna get this right.
The category is the Oscars. Brother and sister who were both nominated for 1969 Oscars. He for a screenplay, she for Best Actress. They didn't win. You have roughly 30 seconds.
Something about Podrowski's dog.
Podrowski's dog.
I was hoping to put
Wilhelm.
write something about it, but there were 2, so I couldn't.
The correct response is, who are Jane Fonda and Peter Fonda? Mr. DeWeese, you wrote down who are Mr. Lisack and Miss Lisack, and that is close but not correct.
Not that old.
And you wagered $1,000, which brings you down to negative $1,400.
I heard you were.
I was born in 72.
Mr. Sentner,
You saw those Oscars, buddy.
you guessed who are the Taylors, and that is incorrect. And you wagered everything, so that drops you down to $0. Mr. Lisack, you guessed correctly, Peter, who are Peter and Jane Fonda. And you wagered $1,799, so that brings you up to $5,599. You're our Jeopardy champion.
Congrats.
Thank you for watching our first episode of Jeopardy this year. Tune in soon for episode 2.